At the same time, I'm working with all these young artists where it's the first exhibitions anywhere, or the first show in America. So I was working with the young German artist Albert Oehlen, and out of the blue he said to me, "Well, what's your next exhibition?" And oh no, without not knowing what the exhibition is, he said to me, the American artist who had the biggest influence on me is Malcolm Morley. And I looked at him and I said, "You've got to be kidding, because that's my next show." And I never asked him, "What did you mean by that?" But by him saying it, I went back and rethought Malcolm Morley completely. And it turned out that this was, the rethinking that I had on Malcolm was what these young artists were having. And I was doing a book on Julian Schnabel not long after the Malcolm Morley show, and Malcolm called me out of the blue and he said, "What are you working on?" I said, "Well, I'm doing this book on Julian, and everything he says and does sounds a lot like you." And he said, "Of course." He worked for a brief time for me as a studio assistant. And I said, "I did not know that." He said, "Nobody does." And so then I was able to write, instead of in the conditional tense, I now could write with authority that there is this continuity from the ideas of Malcolm Morley to Julian Schnabel. And I hadn't given Julian the book to read before it was published, and when I saw him, he walked right up to me and said, in the most biblical tone you can imagine, "You wrote what had to be written." So I see it, there's incredible continuity from one to the other, and they might look completely different or have nothing to do with each other. I mean, I've also worked with artists from all over the world, and I see these connections, or they change my thinking of the way I'm going to approach it. My favorite is with Malcolm Morley. I would stay with him and his wife out in Bellport. We would just talk over breakfast, and he too said, "How come you're not asking me any questions?" I said, you besides years and years of psychiatrists, going to psychiatrists, and every interview you could possibly have with the art press, you have your pat answers, because I hear you I hear you talking on the phone. It's rote. I said, I look for patterns in what you do and say. And I one day made the observation to him, because he was very close with Richard Archwager, and I said, Richard Archwager went for the images that were non-aesthetic, that there was not the images that he appropriated for his paintings. You, on the other hand, are taking images that have been filtered through a art director and a picture editor, because he would never change his pictures that he used for his paintings. And therefore, there is a continuity with art history in your paintings, because you don't change the frame from the reproduction. And he first was arguing with me on that, and that it wasn't. And I showed him, one of his recent paintings, which was the death of Dale Earnhardt. I showed him his painting, which was from the New York Times, his front page. It was exactly as it appeared there. And I had the original AP photograph of the crash. That was the uncropped. And I said, this uncropped photograph was cropped by the photo editor and the art editor of the front page of the New York Times to create a greater sense of action and composition that has, connected it with, go back to the death of General Wolfe by West, and that's what you used. And the next morning he comes down for breakfast and he says, my paintings are based on images that have already been filtered through art directors who are classically trained through art history and art composition. And his wife said, "Score one for Bonnie." So then he became so self-conscious of it, he changed his way of working. But so it says a lot of times the artists aren't even aware of what they're doing because it is rote. It is something that they just do naturally. And so in this case, I felt bad that I had made him self-conscious about the way he was working, and once he realized it, he had to change.